guess what, about 10 lines from the bottom. So, all right, let's get started. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan for Rabbi Elazar, the Amri Tarvaihu. So we're about, again, about 10 lines from the bottom, about 3 lines from where the lines get wide. Rabbi Yochanan for Rabbi Elazar, the Amri Tarvaihu, Rishonim sheniskale avonam niskale kitzam. Chronim shelo niskale avonam lo niskale kitzam. The first Mikdash, those living during the first temple, their sins were made public, and at the same time, their geula, their redemption, was made public as well. That there was a prophecy that Galus Bavel would last for 70 years and no longer. During the second temple, the sins were not made public. The sin was hidden, the sin of sinas chinam, of baseless hatred, and the end of the Galus is not made public either, and our Galus continues with no end promised to it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan tovat tzipornon shel rishonim mikreson shel achronim. And Rabbi Yochanan said that the fingernail of the first generation of the first Beis Hamikdash is greater than that of the greater than the entire body of the later generations. Amalei Rish Lakish said to him, Adarabba, achronim adifi. Rish Lakish said no, to the contrary, the later generations are greater. Why is that? Afagav the ikas shibud malchios ka'aski Torah. That even though, although there is shibud malchios, we're subservient to the other to other kingdoms, and we're persecuted by other kingdoms. Ka'aski Torah. They nevertheless they are involved in Torah study. So Rish Lakish felt that merit actually made the later generations greater. Amalei bira tochiach shechazro l'rishonim v'lo chazro l'achronim. So Rabbi Yochanan answered him back. Rabbi Yochanan said, I can use the temple itself as a proof that it returned for the first generation. It did not return for the later generations. So clearly the first generations are greater than the later generations. Sha'al was Rabbi Elazar. They asked Rabbi Elazar, Rishonim gedolim or achronim gedolim? Which generation is greater? Amalahem tenu einechem babira. So he answered the same way. He said, lift your eyes to the temple. That the fact that it returned for the earlier generations and not for the later generations. Some say that his language was a little different. He said, Eidechem bira, the temple is your witness. The same idea that it returned for the earlier generations, it did not return for the later generations. Rish Lakish have a sachi b'yardena. Rish Lakish was immersing in the Yarden, in the Jordan River. Asa Rabba bar Bachana Yohav leYada. So Rabba bar Bachana was passing by. He gave him his hand to assist him out of the water. Amalei elakos sanina lechu. So Rish Lakish said to him, Rabba bar Bachana was among the sages of Bavel, of Babylonia, and Rish Lakish said to him, elakos sanina lechu. Hashem hates you. Why? Because the people of Bavel, he didn't mean it personally, but the people of Bavel did not return, the majority did not return to Eretz Yisrael for the building of the second temple. So this is a pasuk in Shir Hashirim, which says, if it would be a wall, we would build on top of it above it a crown of silver. If it's a door, we will attach to it a beam of erez of cedar wood. If you would all have returned, you would have been like a wall. You would have returned in mass during the time of Ezra to rebuild the temple. You would have been compared to silver that rot cannot happen to it, that it cannot rot. However, now that you returned piecemeal, only a few of you returned like a door in the wall. Nimshaltim ka'erez, you are comparable to the wood, only to wood. Shaharekev sholetbo, that wood can rot and it can be hollowed out. My erez, what does it mean that it is a cedar wood? Amar ula sas magor. My sas magor, amar. So sas magor is referring to a worm that can come and eat out the wood and turn it hollow, and can hollow it out on the inside. So it can turn it into a hollow piece of wood, where on the outside it appears to be a healthy piece of wood, but the inside has been hollowed out and weakened. So the same thing during Bayis Sheni, although there was an appearance of the presence of Hashem, there was an appearance of the presence of the Shekhinah, but it was hollow. It was not complete. It was not entirely whole, and therefore it's referred to like this sasmagor. My sasmagor, Amar Abba Basko. So sasmagor is comparable to the Basko, to a heavenly voice. That in the second temple there was no prophecy, there was only a heavenly voice that gave some sort of direction from heaven, but it was not in comparison to an actual prophecy. The Tanya, as we learned in the Brisa, Mishemesu Neviim Hoachron Chagai Zechariah Malachi, and the later the last of the prophets, or Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, were members of the Anshe Knesset Hagadol. Nestalka Ruach HaKodesh miYisrael. Ruach HaKodesh left the Jewish people. However, they still made use of a heavenly voice. On occasion, there would be a heavenly voice that would give direction. So the Gemara now asks about this story that we said Reish Lakish engaged in conversation with Rabbi Bar Bachana. So the Gemara says it cannot be. Reish Lakish mimshtoi bahadei Rabbi Bar Bachana. Is it true that Reish Lakish engaged in conversation with Rabbi Bar Bachana? If in the case of Rabbi Lazar, who was considered the leader of the Jewish people, of the sages in Eretz Yisrael, and Reish Lakish not engage in public conversation with him, because Reish Lakish did not normally engage in conversation with most people, and he avoided public conversation. And if he did engage in public conversation with an individual, it was a sign of greatness for that individual, and we would then trust that individual to the extent that people would give him money without witnesses, because they would automatically trust that he would pay them back. So that was only true because Reish Lakish did not normally engage in conversation. So it's unlikely that he would have engaged in conversation with Rabbi Bar Bachana. So Amar Papa Shadigavra Benayu. So Rav Papa says there must be an individual missing in this story, in relating over this story. Or Reish Lakish Hava Uzeiri. If the story actually plays with Reish Lakish, it must have been Zeiri, who was equal to Reish Lakish, whom the story happened with. Or Rabbi Bar Bachana Hava Rabbi Lazar. Or if you say the story was with Rabbi Bar Bachana, it must have been Rabbi Lazar, who was in the river, who then commented and not Reish Lakish. When they came before Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Lei, Lav Hainu Taima, Inami Sliku Kulu B'Yemei Ezra, they'll have a Shar Yeshchina B'Mikdash Sheni. Rabbi Yochanan said it's not true. That's not the reason why there was no Shekhinah, no presence of Hashem in the second temple, not because the Jewish people did not return in mass, but rather Tichsiv Yafta Lokim Liefes V'Yishkon Ba'ohel Hashem. Going on to Yud Amud Aleph. So rather, it's because the pasuk says Hashem will turn to Yefes. However, he will Yishkon Ba'ohel Hashem. He will be Shochin, his Shechina, his presence will rest in the tents of Shem, and that teaches us Afagav the Yafta Lokim Yefes Ein Hashchina Shora Ella Ba'ohel Hashem. So this pasuk is teaching me that although Hashem will grant favor to Yefes, which is Rashi explains that this is a reference to, and the Gemara is going to say this clearly. This is a reference to the Parsium, to the Persians, because the second temple was built by the Persians. So the second temple was built by the Persians, and Hashem granted favor to that temple. However, the Shechina did not rest in it. The Shechina only rested on Ahale Shem, on the temple that was built by the children of Shem, by Shlomo HaMelech, that he built the first temple, and the Shechina rested on his temple, but not on the temple built by the Persians. Says the Gemara, how do we know that the Persians actually were descendants of Yefes? B'nei Yefes, Gomer, Umagog, Umadai, V'Yavan, V'Tuval, Meshech, V'Tiras, because the pasuk listing the progeny, the children of Yefes, states the children of Yefes were Gomer, Magog, Umadai, V'Yavan, V'Tuval, Umeshech, V'Tiras. Gomer zu Germania. That is referring to the nations of Germania, which is likely to be the Germanic nations. Magog is Candia, Mada is Macedonia, or there are different girsos, different versions of this. Yavon Kemashmao, Tuval Zebesu Naiki, Meshech Zumusia, Tiras. So each one of those is a different nation. It's not so critical to us to go through which nations. Sorry, each one of those is a different nation. Tiras, Plihi Barav Simoy Varabana, Amila Rav Simon Varabana. So there's a dispute who Tiras is referring to, what nation is Tiras referring to. So Amazu based Turaiki, some say it's referring to the house of Turaiki, V'chad Amazu Paras. And one opinion says that this is referring to Paras. So if this is referring to the Persians, we see that the Persians were descendants of Yefes. Tani Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef says, Tiras zu Paras. Safta v'rama v'saftecha. So he says Tiras is Paras, and therefore you see that they're children of Yefes. Then it says Safta v'rama v'saftecha are also children of Yefes. Tani Rav Yosef, Sakistan, Guyasa v'Sakistan. These are referring to. These are referring to the nations of Guyasa and Sakistan. The Sakistan Braisa and the outer Sakistan. Ben Chada L'Chada Meya Parsi, Behekefa Alpha Parsi. Between each one was 1,000 Parsi, 1,000 pras, which is a measure of distance. Behekefa Alpha Parsi, and its borders were 1,000 pras. V'Tireshis Mamlachto. This is referring to Nimrod. The beginning of his kingship was Bavel Va'arach Va'akad V'Chalne. Bavel Kamashma. Bavel is referring to Bavel, to Babylonia. Erech zu Urichus, Va'akad ze Bishchar, Kalne ze Nofer Ninfi. Mina'aretz ahi yatsa Ashur, and from that land, Ashur, Assyria came out. Tani Rav Yosef, Ashur zu Silik. The Ashur is referring to the nation of Silik. Vayiven es Ninve ves Rechovos Ir ves Kolach. And Ashur built Ninve and Rechovos Ir and Kolach. Ninve Kmashma'o. Ninve was the famous city of Ninve that we find described in the book of Yonah. Rechovos Ir zu Pras, and Rechovos is referring to Paras. The Mishon Kalach zu Pras to Borsif. One is they're referring to two different cities that were built along the river of Paras, the Euphrates River. Vas Resen ben and Kalach he ha'ira gadola. Resen was built between Ninveh and Kalach, and this is the great city. That's how the Torah describes it. So Resen za'ak tisfon he ha'ira gadola. This is the great city. So the pronoun he ha'ira Hagadola, this is the great city. It's not clear who the pronoun is referring to. Which city is the pronoun referring to? Is it referring to Resen, or is it referring back to Ninveh? Im Resen or Hagadola, is it referring to Resen? Since it says in the book of Yonah that Ninveh was a great city before Hashem, and it took 3 days to walk from one side of the city to the other. Have a Omer Ninvehi Ha'ir Hagadola. So you see that when it says the great city, it's referring back to Ninveh and not to Resen. Okay, V'sham Achiman Sheisha V'Talmai Yilideha Anak, and there were there were Shisha, Achimon, Shesha, V'Talmai, 3 brothers who were Yelidei Ho'anak, were the children of giants. Tana, Achimon, Miyuman, Sheba Achim. Achimon is referred to, the name Achimon means he was the strongest of the brothers. Sheshai, Shemesim, Sa'aretz, Keshchisos. Sheshai, that he turned, the reason why he had the name of Sheshai was because he turned the earth into ruins. When he walked across the earth, he was so large and so powerful that he would crush things beneath his feet. Talmai shemesim sa'aretz tilamim. Talmai is referred to the name Talmai because when he walked, he turned the ground into furrows beneath his feet. Davar acher, another interpretation. Achiman bana anas, Sheshai bana alush, Talmai bana talbush. So each one of those built a different city. They built the cities of Anas, Alush, and Talbush. Yilidei Ho'anak, they're called the children of giants. The word Anak, Shema Anikin Hachama B'Komasan, that they appeared to be wearing the sun as a necklace. In other words, they were so large and so tall that their heads would block out the light of the sun. Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi said in the name of Rabbi, Asida Romi Shetipo Biyad Paras, that the kingdom of the empire of Rome will fall to the Persian Empire. Shenemar Lochein Shimu Atzas Hashem Sheyoatz al Edom. Listen to the words of Hashem that he prophesied about Edom. Umachshevosav Ashachoshav al Yoshvei Teman. And his thoughts that he is thinking about those of Teman. Imlo yischavum tzirei hatzon, imlo yasem alehem nevehem, lo yashim alehem nevehem. That if they will not be conquered by tzirei hatzon, the youngest of the flock of sheep, if you will not decimate their cities on them. So the tzirei hatzon, according to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, is referring to the youngest of the flock, is referring to the Persians. So Maskifla, Rabba Barula, my mashma de haitzi parasu. So how do you know that the youngest of the flock is referring to the Persians? Dichsiv. So answers the Gemara. Dichsiv ha'ayol asher ro'isa bala karnayim malche modai uparas. This is Nebuchadnezzar's the famous dream of Nebuchadnezzar, where he saw this tremendous statue that was created of different animals, and it was interpreted by Daniel to be referring to the different empires that will rise in the world. And Daniel said, Ho'ayol, the goat that you saw with the horns, is referring to Modai Uparas. So you see that the flock of sheep, of goats, is referring to the Medians and the Persians. Says the Gemara, Ve'ema Yavan. Maybe it's referring to the Greeks. Tichsiv v'hatzifir hasair melech Yavan, and the goat is referring to the kingdom of Greece. So again, it's possible that the goat is referring to Greece, not to the Persians. Kisalak of Chaviva bar Surmaki, when Aviva bar Surmaki came to Eretz Yisrael, Amra Kamei Dahumer Abana. So he repeated this question. He repeated this question of Rabba bar Ula, that perhaps it's referring to Greece, not to the Persians. Amalei, they answered him, Mandalo Yoda Perushe Kroe, Mosiv Tiyufta Rebbe. Is it possible that one who does not even know how to interpret a basic verse in the Torah, he will pose questions to Rebbe? Mai Tzirei Hatzon Zutra Da'achui. The Tzirei Hatzon, the youngest of the flock, is referring to the least of the brothers. The Tani of Yosef, Tiras Zeparas. The youngest of the children of Yefes is Tiras, and Rav Yosef already said that Tiras is referring to Paras. So you see that Tzirei Hatzon, the youngest of the flock, must be referring to the Persians. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rav Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Loi, Asida Romi Shetipo Biat Paras. He again says that, he also says that Rome will fall into the hands of the Persians. Kal v'chomer. It says it's a kal v'chomer. All the more so. Mam mikdash rishon shebnauhu b'nei shem v'hecherivu kazdiim. If the first temple, which was built by Bnei Shem, by Shlomo HaMelech, and it was destroyed by the Kazdiim, the Chaldeans, who's a reference to the Chaldeans, are the same as the Babylonians. The Gemara uses the term interchangeably. Naflu kasdim biyad parsim. And the ones who destroyed the temple, the Chaldeans, fell into the hands of the Persians, right? The Persians were the ones who killed out the family of Nebuchadnezzar. They defeated Belshazzar in battle, and they took over the empire of the Chaldeans. So Mikdash Sheni Shebnauhu Parsium Vechrivuhu Romium. So certainly the second temple, which was destroyed, which was built by the Persians and was destroyed by the Romans. Enodin Sheyiplu Romium Biad Parsium. It must be that the Persians would want to exact their revenge from the Romans. So it makes sense that the Roman Empire will fall into the hands of the Persians. Amarav Asida Parash Shatipo Biad Romi. Rav, however, says the exact opposite, that the Persians will fall into the hands of the Romans. Amrule Rav Kahana Rav Asi Rav. So Rav Kahana and Rav Asi asked Rav, Benuye Biad Sisure. Is it possible that the ones who built the Beis Hamikdash, the ones who built the temple, will fall into the hands of the ones who destroyed the temple? It's not just, right? What's the justification? Where is the justice behind that? Why should the ones who built the temple, who were at least somewhat seemingly righteous, why should they fall into the hands of the ones who were evil, who destroyed the temple? Amalahu in Gezeras Melachi. He said, yes, this was a Gezerah. This is the will of Hashem. This is a decree of heaven, and we can't ask questions about it. Although to us it doesn't seem to be justified, it doesn't seem to follow the rules of justice. Nevertheless, this is how Hashem wanted it to be. Some say he gave a different answer. Amar lahu, he said to them, Inunami hakasasri bekinishta. They too, the Persians, they destroyed many synagogues. They destroyed many places of worship. And therefore, you see that even though they built the temple, they did so for their own purposes, not because they were righteous. And therefore, they too deserve to fall into the hands of other nations. Tanya Nami Hachi, we learned this similarly in a Brisa. Asida Paras Shatipo Biyad Romi, that the Persians will fall into the hands of the Romans. Chada de Sasri Beknishta. One reason is because they destroyed the places of worship, the synagogues, the shuls. Va'od Gezeras Melechu. And furthermore, it is a decree of heaven, Sheyiplu Bonin Biat Sosrin, that those who built the temple will fall into the hands of those who destroyed it. The Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav, in Ben David Ba, because Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav that Mashiach, the son of David, will not come to the world Tifshot Malchus Romi Harisha, until the evil Roman Empire will spread B'chala Olam Kula, across the entire world, Tisha Chadashim, for at least 9 months. Shenema Elochein Yitneim Eis Ad Eis Yoleda Yolda V'Yeser Echav Yeshuvin Al Bnei Yisrael, that Hashem will give the world over into the hands of this nation until the time of birth, which means the extent of pregnancy, which is 9 months. And then, and only then, V'Yeser Echav, the rest of his brethren, referring to Klal Yisrael, will be given over to the Bnei Yisrael. Okay. So the Gemara now goes back to the discussion of the Mishnah of the Kohen Gadol being taken to the Lishkas Parhedrin, to the office of the Parhedrin, and the Gemara is now going to discuss these rooms, these offices that were built into the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple, and it's going to have a discussion about the status of these rooms. Tanu Rabbana. So we learned in the Brisa, Kol HaLishkos, Kol HaLishkos Shahayu BeMikdash. All of these offices that were in the Mikdash, that were built into the walls of the temple, Lo Hayu Lahen Mezuzah, they were not obligated to have a mezuzah on the doors because they were not lived in. They were used for specific purposes, but they were never used to live in. Chutz mi lishkas parhedrin shahayu ba beis dira lekohen gadol. So except for this Lishkas Parhedrin, which was used during the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur for the Kohen Gadol to stay in the Kohen Gadol to sleep in, and therefore was obligated in mezuzah. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, there were actually many offices that were used for people to reside in, right? Even if they didn't sleep there, they used it for their purposes. And they did not have a mezuzah. Ella lishkas parhedrin gezera haisa. Rather, the lishkas parhedrin was a specific reason. Okay, why the Chachamim instituted, so it was not a d'oraisa. A good question, John Perrin. Does that mean that a business doesn't need a mezuzah? The obligation, I believe, is not d'oraisa. Okay, is not. I believe it's rabbinic, although don't quote me on that. I have to look it up, but I believe that the obligation d'oraisa is only a place where a person will actually reside, will actually live there. So Rabbi Yehuda says that therefore the obligation is not d'oraisa in this case. Rather, it's only d'Rabbanan, and was a specific enactment d'Rabbanan that the Lishkas Parhedrin should have a mezuzah. And Rashi explains, the Gemara is going to explain much later on Amud Beis, that the reason why the Chachamim enacted this is that people should not say that the Kohen Gadol is chavush b'veiso asur, and the Kohen Gadol is locked up in jail, that he's left in a place which is not fit for a person to live there. So therefore, we put a mezuzah there to show that this is a place where a person lives, and therefore the Kohen Gadol is being held in a hotel, in luxury, rather than being imprisoned in this room. But it was only the Rabbanan. My taima de Rabbi Yehuda. So says the Gemara, what is the reasoning behind Rabbi Yehuda? Amar Rava Kasava Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds kol bayis sheina asur li'imos hachamav li'imos hageshamim eno bayis. Rabbi Yehuda says that a home which is only used temporarily, or it's only used for certain parts of the year, but not always. It's not used throughout the entire year. It's not considered a bayis. It's not considered a home. And when the Torah says al mezuzos beisecha, when the Torah says place it on the doorposts of your home, it is not including a home that is only used for certain parts of the year. Abaye. So Abaye questioned this. This is a prophecy about the destruction of the kingdom of the Malchei Yisrael, and it says that I will smite the Beis HaChoref, the winter home, on the summer home, and the summer home, because in those days the kings had separate winter homes which were built in the warmer areas and were insulated better, and they had summer homes which were cooler, more open, to keep them cool during the summer. So Amalei said to him, Beis Choref ubeis Kayetz Ikri, they refer to as a winter home, a summer home, but then Bayis Stama lo Ikri, but they're not referred to as a home. So when the Torah says mezuzos beisecha, it's referring to something that has the status of a home, but not something that's called a summer home or called a winter home. Esivei Abaye. So Abaye posed the question to this: is it true? Can we say that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a home which is only used temporarily is not obligated in mezuzah? But we learned Sukkos Hechag B'Chag, that the sukkah which is built on Sukkos, Rabbi Yehuda Mechayev v'Chachamim Potrin. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's obligated in a mezuzah, and the Chachamim hold it's not. Right? So you see, to the contrary, Rabbi Yehuda says that even though a sukkah obviously is only used temporarily, it's only used for 7 or 8 days during Sukkos. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda holds it's obligated in a mezuzah. V'tani Allah, and we learned about this. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev be'eruv or be'mezuzah or be'maaser. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's obligated in eruv, meaning if it opens up to a courtyard, it's considered a house. It's considered a permanent place of living, and it will obligate the entire chutzner, the entire courtyard, in an eruv chatzeros, and otherwise people will not be permitted to carry there. And it's obligated in mezuzah. And it has the status of a home. that the halacha is a person is permitted to eat what we call arai, like a snack, from grain or other things that are growing in the fields, even without taking off trumos and masros. However, once he brings it into his home, so then he's not allowed to eat from it at all until he takes off truma and maser. What is considered bringing it to his home? So Rabbi Yehuda says, even if he brings it to the sukkah, that's considered as if he brought it into his home, and he's not allowed to eat from it. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda holds a sukkah is considered a permanent place of dwelling. So v'chit hema midrabanan. So perhaps you'll tell me that's only midrabanan. That's only a rabbinic enactment, but really Rabbi Yehuda holds that the sukkah is not considered a home. So bishlama eruv umezuzah ikol mema midrabanan. So says the Gemara that makes sense regarding eruv. That it will obligate everyone in the courtyard to have an eruv chatzeros. So eruv is only an obligation midrabanan. So it makes sense that the chachamim can obligate them based on a sukkah. Mezuzah, we can also say that mezuzah is not a doraisa obligation, but the chachamim instituted that obligation regarding the sukkah. Ela maaser, however, regarding maaser, mi'ikal lemeimar midrabanan, can we say that it was only a rabbinic obligation to take off maaser, but it's not doraisa, and the rabbanon, the chachamim would enact such a gezerah, meaning they would create a situation where one is only taking off maaser midrabanan, going on to Yud Amud Beis. So it says the Gemara, it can't be. The chachamim would never make such a gezerah, such an enactment. Because it could lead to a disaster, because you might have a case where a person will take off trumos and maisros from this grain, which is only obligated midrabanan, and he will use that to take off truma and maser on other grain, which is obligated to oraisa. And the halacha is that the maser does not take effect in that case. The truma and maser actually does not take effect, because on a doraisa level, from a doraisa perspective, he's using grain which has no obligation to fulfill the obligation on grain which does have a doraisa obligation. And the halacha is that you cannot do such a thing, and the maser does not take effect at all. So what's going to happen is that this person thinks that he took off truma and maser. In reality, he did not fulfill his obligation. He's going to end up eating tevel. So the chachamim would never create such a gezerah which could lead to such a disaster happening, because they're misleading the people. So it can't be that maser is only midrabanan. It must be that it's doraisa. So Tosfos already poses the question amongst other Rishonim that we find many cases where the Rabbanan enacted an obligation of maaser that was only midrabanan, that was only rabbinic and not doraisa. Namely, like what we talked about yesterday, there's an obligation of demai, right? In case where one buys grain from someone who cannot be trusted to keep Torah and mitzvahs properly, he has to take off maaser. He has to take off not truma, but he has to take off maaser again a second time, as the chachamim instituted. So you see that the chachamim instituted many cases where there's an obligation only midrabanan. So Tosfos says that in those cases, the obligation was clearly distinct. It was obvious that the obligation is only midrabanan. Like we said yesterday, one is not obligated to take off truma. They're only obligated to take off maaser, and even the maaser that they take off, they're not obligated to actually give it to the Levi. They can keep it for themselves, and therefore it was obvious to all that this is only a rabbinic obligation. So they would never come to mistake it for that of doraisa, and they'll never come to combine it with an obligation doraisa. But here, if the Rabbanan instituted a gezerah midrabanan to take off truma and maaser, it would be superficially it would seem to be identical to that of the doraisa, and one could come to confuse it with that of the doraisa, which could lead to this disaster happening when they would take off trumas and maisros, which would not actually take effect, and a person would end up eating tevel. So nevertheless, the Gemara's question is that if we find that there's an obligation of maaser, that is an obvious indication that we're operating on the doraisa level. And if Rabbi Yehuda says that one's obligated in mezuzah, it would seem to be doraisa. So Ella Amar Abaye, so rather says Abaye as follows. Beshiva de kuli alma lo pligi de mechayva. So during the 7 days that the Kohen Gadol actually resides in this room in the Lishkas Parhedrin, all agree, both the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda agree, that there is an obligation of mezuzah. Ki pligi b'shar yemos hashana. So when is there a dispute? When is there a machlokes? So that's only referring to the other days of the year. The rest of the year, when the Kohen Gadol is not there, so then there's a machlokes whether there's an obligation of mezuzah. Rabbanan Savri, Gazrinon Sha'ar Yemos Hashana Atu Shiva. The Chachamim say that once we had an obligation during the time of when the Kohen Gadol was there for the 7 days before Yom Kippur, so then we continued that obligation even for the rest of the year. Rabbi Yehuda says that no, the obligation only applies during the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur, but not the rest of the year. Amar le Rava, so Rava said your interpretation is not possible. But going back to the case of Sukkah, we said that there's a dispute of the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, even during Sukkot itself, that the Chachamim held that there's no obligation of mezuzah whatsoever, even during the time that we're actually living in the Sukkah, during the Yom Tov of Sukkot. So if that's the case, then it must be that the opinion of the Chachamim would apply even during the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur. Ela Amar Rava, rather says Rava, B'shar Yemos Hashana Kuli Alma Lo Pligi de Petura. Rather, it's exactly the opposite. During the rest of the year, when the Kohen Gadol does not actually reside in this lishka, in this room, so everybody agrees that there's no obligation of mezuzah. Ki pligi b'shiva. Rather, when is there a machlokes? The machlokes is only during the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur. The sukkah taima lechud, the lishka taima lechud. And each one has a different reason. The reason regarding sukkah is separate from the reason regarding this lishka, regarding this room. Okay, sukkah taima lechud. Rabbi Yehuda letamei, the Amar sukkah diras keva bo'inon umachayva b'mezuzah. So there, the machlokes is as follows. Rabbi Yehuda says that when the Torah obligated us in the building of a sukkah, it was intended to be a permanent structure, even though obviously it's only going to be used for the 7 days of the Chag, for the 7 days of the Yom Tov. Nevertheless, it has to have the status of a permanent structure. Now, if it has the status of a permanent structure, then it's obligated in mezuzah. The Chachamim, to the contrary, held that no, sukkah is required to be a temporary structure because the entire purpose is to resemble the sukkahs, the temporary structures that the Jews lived in during their time in the desert. So therefore, there's no obligation of mezuzah because we want to show that it's only a temporary structure. Okay, the lishka taima lechud, and the lishkas parhedrin had a separate reason for the machlokes, why whether or not it's obligated in mezuzah. Rabbanan Savri dira bal karcha shma dira. Rabbi Yehuda Savri dira bal karcha lo shma dira. So the Chachamim hold that a dira bal karcha, a place where a person resides against his will, and what we mean by against his will here means that the Kohen Gadol was obligated to move into this room for the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur, not by his choice because he wants to live there, but rather he's obligated to by halacha, and therefore that's considered a place where a person does not actually want to reside there. He's going there against his will. Okay, good question. If it's so that goes back to the question of that was mentioned on Amud Aleph regarding the Bayis Choref and the Bayis Akai. It's a winter home and a summer home, it seems that the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda is that it's not obligated, but it seems that the opinion of the Rabbanon would be that there is an obligation, even though it's only used for different parts of the year. So it would seem that there would be an obligation. Okay. So here it says the Gemara, the machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, is whether or not a room where a person resides there against his will, only because he's obligated to do so, whether or not that's considered living there, and whether there's an obligation of mezuzah. The Chachamim hold that it is, and therefore there is an obligation. Rabbi Yehuda holds that midoraisa, it's not considered living there. Umidurabbanan hu de takinula, and it was only a gezerah durabbanan that there should be put a mezuzah there, shelo yomru, like we mentioned already on Amud Aleph and Rashi, shelo yomru kohen gadol chavush beveis ha'asurin, so that people should not say that the kohen gadol is being locked up in prison, and the proof that the kohen gadol is being locked up there against his will is that there's no mezuzah on this lishka. So you see that clearly the kohen gadol is residing here against his will, and the chachamim are as if they're locking him up there. They're imprisoning him there. So therefore, the Chachamim instituted that although there's no deoraisa obligation for there to be a mezuzah there, the Chachamim instituted that there should be one there to indicate that the Kohen Gadol is living there because he wants to fulfill the obligations of halacha and because he wants to be pure for Yom Kippur, and not that he's being held there against his will. Okay, we will stop here. And Rabbi Fischer should be back for tomorrow. Okay, everyone have a wonderful day, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.